There are moments in history so familiar that we stop asking questions about them. We recognize the photograph. We remember a few famous words. We know the ending. But somewhere between the textbooks and the memorials, the man became a monument. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as a dreamer, a preacher, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a symbol of hope. But symbols don't receive death threats in the middle of the night. Symbols don't watch their homes bombed while their families are inside. Symbols don't wrestle with fear, doubt, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of knowing that every speech could be their last. Long before he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. was simply a young pastor who never expected history to call his name. Yet when that moment came, he faced a choice that would alter the course of the United States forever. This is not just the story of a speech. It is the story of a nation divided, of ordinary people who chose extraordinary courage, and of one man who discovered that the price of justice is often paid long before victory is won. Because the road to "I have a dream" was not paved with applause. It was lined with jail cells, anonymous letters, shattered windows, constant surveillance, and a growing certainty that someone wanted him dead. We will go beyond the legend to uncover the man, the movement, and the moments that reshaped America forever. This is the story of Martin Luther King Jr. Before Martin Luther King Jr. became the voice of a movement, he was simply a boy growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a world where the color of a person's skin determined where they could eat, learn, worship, and even drink water. Born on January 15, 1929, into a family deeply rooted in faith, Martin was raised in the home of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father preached with conviction and his mother filled the house with music and learning. His parents taught him that every person was created with dignity, yet the streets outside their front door often told a different story. As a child, Martin experienced the sting of segregation firsthand, when a close white friend was suddenly forbidden from playing with him because of the color of his skin. The moment left a wound that never fully healed. Rather than planting hatred, it sparked questions. Why could people who worship the same God be treated so differently? Those questions would follow him into adulthood, quietly shaping the convictions that would one day challenge an entire nation. By 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. had earned a doctorate in theology and accepted the role of pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. At just 26 years old, he was new to the city, focused on serving his congregation and building a life with his wife, Coretta. He had no plans to lead a national movement, but history rarely asks who is ready. On December 1st, 1955, a local seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat to a white passenger on a segregated city bus. Her arrest ignited long-standing frustration within Montgomery's black community. Local leaders gathered to organize a response and chose the young pastor to speak, believing his fresh perspective and respected reputation could unite the city. Standing before a packed church, King delivered a speech that transformed him overnight from an unknown minister into the public face of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It was a role that would forever change his life and the future of America. The Montgomery Bus Boycott was supposed to last only a few days. City leaders believed frustration would fade, workers would return to the buses, and life would continue as it always had. Instead, the boycott stretched into months, becoming a powerful symbol of resistance and unity. Every morning, thousands of people walked miles to work, organized carpools, and endured inconvenience because they believed something larger than themselves was at stake. But behind the scenes, the pressure began to build on Martin Luther King Jr. The attention that brought him influence also brought danger. His phone rang with threats. Strangers followed him. Hate filled his mailbox. In January 1956, a bomb exploded at his home while his wife Coretta and their infant daughter were inside. When King arrived and saw the crowd gathered outside, he faced a moment that would define his leadership. He stood on his porch and spoke to those ready to fight back. He told them that their movement could not be built on revenge or violence. They had chosen a different path, one based on courage, discipline, and the belief that justice could overcome hatred. The boycott continued. The nation began to notice, and a young pastor from Atlanta found himself carrying the hopes of millions. The success of the Montgomery Bus Boycott proved something many had doubted. A movement built on peaceful resistance could challenge powerful institutions and force the nation to confront its own contradictions. But the victory also came with a warning. The fight for equality would not be won in a single city or with a single protest. The struggle ahead would stretch across the South, through courtrooms, churches, and streets, where ordinary people would be asked to stand against extraordinary pressure. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization created to coordinate nonviolent campaigns across the region. King became its president, placing him at the center of a growing movement. But leadership came with a heavy price. The FBI began monitoring him. Critics questioned his methods. Segregationists saw him as a threat to the social order they had defended for generations. Every speech, every march, and every public appearance carried risk. Yet King believed that lasting change would not come through fear or retaliation. He looked to the teachings of faith and the philosophy of nonviolence, inspired by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, believing that moral courage could expose injustice more powerfully than anger ever could. By the end of the 1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer simply a pastor from Montgomery. He had become the face of a movement that was forcing America to look directly at the promises written in its own founding documents, and the painful reality of how many people were still denied those promises. By 1963, the battle for civil rights had reached a critical moment. In Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in America, Martin Luther King Jr. and his fellow activists designed to expose the realities of racial injustice to the entire nation. They knew Birmingham would not be easy. They knew the response could be harsh. But they also knew that silence had allowed segregation to survive for generations. Thousands of people joined the demonstrations. Many were arrested, including King himself. From his jail cell, he wrote one of the most important documents of the civil rights movement, explaining why peaceful protest was necessary when the law itself protected injustice. Then came the images that shocked the world. Television cameras captured children being met with police dogs and powerful water hoses. The scenes traveled across America and around the globe, forcing millions to witness the cruelty that many had tried to ignore. The pressure grew. Business leaders, politicians, and citizens could no longer pretend the problem did not exist. Birmingham became a turning point, proving that peaceful resistance could reveal injustice more clearly than any argument. The movement had gained momentum, but the biggest moment was still ahead. Soon, hundreds of thousands would gather in Washington, and Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver words that would become forever connected with the dream of equality. By 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. had helped bring national attention to the fight for civil rights, but the struggle was far from over. Across the South, many African Americans were still denied the basic right to vote through intimidation, unfair laws, and violence. In Selma, Alabama, activists decided that the time had come to confront the issue directly. The first march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge ended in violence as peaceful protesters were attacked by law enforcement. The images of brutality shocked the nation and created a moment that could not be ignored. Once again, television brought the reality of injustice into American homes. Weeks later, King and thousands of marchers completed the journey from Selma to Montgomery, turning a painful confrontation into a powerful symbol of determination. Their efforts helped lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most significant victories of the civil rights era. But as the movement achieved historic progress, new challenges emerged. King began speaking more openly about poverty, economic inequality, and the struggles faced by communities beyond the South. Some supporters questioned this new direction. Some powerful voices turned against him. Yet King continued forward, believing that justice could not stop at one issue or one victory. The dream was never only about changing laws. It was about changing lives. By the late 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. had already changed America forever. The victories of the civil rights movement had broken down legal segregation and expanded voting rights, but King believed the fight was entering a new and even more difficult chapter. Freedom on paper did not always mean equality in everyday life. Across America, millions of people continued to struggle with poverty, poor housing, and limited opportunities. King began focusing on economic justice, believing that true freedom required more than the removal of unfair laws. It required creating a society where every person had the chance to build a better life. This new direction brought criticism. Some supporters questioned his message. Others believed he was moving beyond his original mission. The same man once celebrated by many was now facing growing opposition from politicians, the media, and even former allies. But King remained determined. In 1968, he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to support sanitation workers fighting for better wages and dignity on the job. Their signs carried a simple message: "I am a man." For King, those words represented the heart of everything he had fought for. After years of marches, threats, victories, and heartbreak, he arrived in Memphis knowing the struggle was far from finished. He also knew the dangers had never truly gone away. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He had spent his life challenging injustice with words, marches, and a belief that change could come without hatred. But that evening, his journey came to a sudden and tragic end. The news of his assassination spread quickly across the world. Cities erupted in grief and anger. Millions mourned the loss of a leader who had become a symbol of hope, even to those who disagreed with him. But Martin Luther King Jr.'s story did not end on that balcony. The movement he helped lead continued. The laws he fought to change transformed the nation. The ideas he carried into churches, streets, and public squares continued to inspire generations who believed that a better future was possible. Yet, his greatest legacy was not only the victories that followed. It was the question he left behind. Could a nation live up to the promises it made? Could people choose understanding over hatred, courage over silence, and justice over comfort? More than half a century later, those questions still echo. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a man who lived without fear. He was a man who decided that fear would not have the final word. And that may be the most powerful part of his story.